Welcome to 125th Street. This is the area that many people would consider to be the heart of Harlem. And in just a few blocks, we're going to get so much history. Starting with this block right here. Behind me, we have a statue of a very handsome man. His coattails are billowing in the breeze behind him, and he is walking upwards on his pillar. This is Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. is a name that I wish more people knew. I wish it was on par with Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcom X. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was the very first African American from New York to be elected to Congress, and he served in Congress for nearly 3 decades. And he actually was named head of the Education and Labor Committee, which at the time was the highest position in Congress that any African American had ever held. He also led many civil rights movements here in Harlem, which we will talk about in just a bit. On the side of the statue of Adam Clayton Powell, there is a quote. This quote was actually the inspiration for Adam Clayton Powell's very heroic pose on this statue. So the quote says, "Press forward at all times, climbing toward that higher ground on the harmonious society that shapes the laws of man to the laws of God." And that is why we have Adam Clayton Powell striving upward. Also, fun fact, Adam Clayton Powell Jr.'s favorite beverage was scotch and milk. He claimed that the milk helped his ulcers and the scotch helped his nerves. I don't think I'll be having what he's having tonight, but he was a really cool man. We're going to leave the Adam Clayton Powell statue, but we're going to look at a few other buildings that we can see from this exact spot. This is the Adam Clayton Powell Jr. State Office Building, and this is the tallest building in Harlem. It's also the building where Bill Clinton has an office. He opened up the office in 1991, and there was great fanfare here in Harlem. Now we're going to look at the building that held the title of tallest building in Harlem before the Adam Clayton Powell Jr. State Office Building. Across the street from the statue of Adam Clayton Powell Jr., you will see this beautiful white building. That beautiful white building is the Hotel Theresa, or it used to be the Hotel Theresa. It ceased being a hotel in the late 1960s. But it opened up as a hotel in 1913 and was known at the time as the Waldorf of Harlem. And lots of famous guests stay there, ranging from Louis Armstrong to Malcom X to Fidel Castro. The legend is that all of the Midtown hotels, they didn't want Fidel Castro staying there. They kicked him out. And the reason for this was because Fidel Castro would travel with his own entourage of live chickens. He was apparently very afraid of death by poisoning, so he insisted on slaughtering his own chickens before he ate them. Midtown hotels, not so cool with that, but he did receive a much warmer welcome here in Harlem. So I always just get a little chuckle thinking about Fidel Castro staying there with all of his chickens. Now, while a lot of the Hotel Theresa's famous guests were African American guests, it wasn't until 1940 that they ended segregation in the Hotel Theresa. This is something very important to keep in mind as you're exploring Harlem. While we think of Harlem as being a host of the Harlem Renaissance that gave a rise to so many wonderful Black voices, it wasn't always a neighborhood where Black residents could own property, where they could stay in hotels, or where they could watch entertainment. So a lot of Harlem's history talks about this evolution in Harlem of Black rights and civil rights as well. So we're going to talk more about that as we continue on. Follow me. Right now we're in front of a storefront. You'll see these beautiful green outlines around the windows. This used to be the storefront of Bloomingdales department store. A Bloomingdales department store was a rival of department stores such as Macy's at the time. Bloomingdales department store also has a lot of Harlem history attached to it. Now, as more and more Black residents started to move to Harlem, Bloomingdales department store did not keep up with the times. They did not hire Black workers as a policy, and if they did hire Black workers, it was only in the most menial of jobs and the lowest paying jobs. The residents of Harlem realized that this was not fair, and led by our good friend Adam Clayton Powell Jr., they decided to boycott Bloomingdales. They said that they weren't going to shop where they weren't allowed to work. So in 1934, there was a huge boycott in the streets. People were protesting, and Bloomingdales was finally forced to change their policies, and they started to hire Black workers. This was nearly 3 decades before Martin Luther King Jr. gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. So when you think about the civil rights movement, you can think about these early steps that were happening here in Harlem in the 1930s. Speaking of Martin Luther King Jr., on September 20th, 1958, he was actually doing a book signing here at Bloomingdales department store when a woman named Izola Curry came up and stabbed him in the chest with a letter opener. A man went to go to try to remove this letter opener, and everyone said, "Don't touch him." They took Martin Luther King Jr. to the local hospital, and it turned out it was really smart that nobody touched the letter opener, because it was so close to his heart that if he had so much as sneezed, he would have died. He did, however, survive that attack and go on to continue to be a really important member of the civil rights movement. So Bloomingdales department store is no more, but there's a lot of wonderful Harlem history that was attached to this building that used to be home to Bloomingdales. We're now going to go to the Apollo. This is the Apollo Theater. The Apollo Theater gave birth to the careers of so many music legends, ranging from Ella Fitzgerald to Michael Jackson. While the Apollo Theater has given rise to the careers of so many incredible Black artists, this was not always a place where Black audience members were welcome. When the Apollo Theater first opened in 1914, it was a burlesque theater and only white audience members could attend. It wasn't until that burlesque theater closed and the theater reopened as the Apollo in 1934 that Black audience members could go and attend and cheer on their favorite artists. We are standing in front of the entrance to the Apollo Theater. Underneath this marquee, there's actually what's known as the Apollo Walk of Fame. So underneath the Apollo Walk of Fame, you'll see a lot of the names of artists who have performed there, and many of the artists got their starts there. And a lot of artists got their start there in a program known as Amateur Night at the Apollo. Amateur Night at the Apollo gave birth to singing competitions such as Star Search and American Idol. And the idea was that emerging artists would go and perform, and if the audiences loved them, they would cheer, and if the audiences didn't like them, they would boo. And Harlem audiences, they're really hard audiences to please. So if you got booed off the stage, a man known as the executioner would come out with a broom and sweep you off the stage. One of the very first winners of Amateur Night at the Apollo was a young woman who was going to go on stage and dance. But there was a dance troupe that went out before her, and they had these very professional looking costumes and choreography. And this woman was so intimidated that she decided she wasn't going to go out and perform. But she ended up getting pushed out onto the stage, and instead of dancing, she decided to sing. And much to her surprise, she ended up winning the entire competition that night of Amateur Night at the Apollo. That young woman was Ella Fitzgerald, and that's what launched Ella Fitzgerald's singing career. So there we have 125th Street. Super easy to get to on the subway. You can take the 2 or the 3 train, the A, B, C, or D train to 125th Street. There is so much history to explore if you come up. So we have Clayton Powell, we have Hotel Theresa, we have Bloomingdales Department Store, we have the Apollo, which also gives tours and has amazing concerts at night. So hope to see you soon. Make sure you click subscribe so you never miss a New York Minute.